Welcome to Insights into the Industrial Revolution, Part 3, The East India Company. The East India Company often doesn't get the credit it deserves for its role in stimulating the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. The EIC played an important role in the Industrial Revolution in 4 ways. 1. Investment, 2. Raw materials, 3. New markets, and 4. Global distribution. In this video we'll cover these 4 topics, but first let's have a brief history of the East India Company. The history of the East India Company. The East India Company was formed in 1600 and was one of the earliest limited liability companies in the world, meaning that any losses that shareholders faced were restricted to the value of the shares that they owned. The EIC was formed to develop trade with India and other countries in the East. At first the company tried to develop trading links in Indonesia, but conflict with the Dutch restricted opportunities and the company began to focus on India. This proved very profitable, and by 1800 the East India Company controlled most of what is now India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. The East India Company had its own private army of around 260,000 soldiers, much larger than the British Army at the time. As well as India, the East India Company developed trade in China and other Asian countries. But the company was hardly a template for corporate responsibility. Their activities were more often a form of extortion than fair commerce, and fraud and deception were commonly used in trade negotiations. The company actively traded in slaves from 1621 to when slavery was banned in the British Empire in 1833. The East India Company sold opium to the Chinese from 1770, causing serious addiction. When the rulers of China tried to outlaw the trade, the EIC ignored the ban and then fought the First Opium War in 1839. The Peace of 1842 forced the Chinese to accept the sale of opium. The EIC were granted preferential rights to import tea into North America. Competition from colonial American tea importers was restricted, and this led to inflated tea prices. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was a direct consequence of this monopolistic trade, and we can say that the East India Company was one contributor to the American Revolution. The East India Company's rapacious and often brutal treatment of India and its population provided cheap goods and raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution and growing prosperity in Great Britain, but it also impoverished the people of India. This eventually led to an uprising in India against the EIC in 1857. The revolt was put down with much bloodshed, and 100,000 or more Indian civilians were killed. British forces massacred women, children and wounded Indian soldiers, as well as committing torture and other atrocities on a large scale. The scale of the uprising shocked the British government into action, and the racist policies of the East India Company and its harsh treatment of the population were seen to be a significant cause. The East India Company was dissolved in 1858, and its territories, army and administration were taken over by the British government. Queen Victoria was made Empress of India, education was improved, and Indians were allowed to take jobs in the civil service. Reform was slow, and British rule was still resented. India, Pakistan and Bangladesh became independent in 1947. Investment in the Industrial Revolution. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, in which the army of the East India Company defeated a much larger native Indian force with French advisors, gave the EIC control over Bengal and set the foundation for their control of the whole subcontinent in subsequent years. This was a hugely profitable victory, allowing the company to collect vast revenues in taxes. This wealth was exported to Britain and formed a crucial part of the investment in the early Industrial Revolution, particularly in textile manufacturing. The EIC also generated vast profits from its sales of spices, opium and textiles, which created a class of wealthy merchants and helped develop British banking and insurance networks. These capital flows enabled the City of London to become the most important financial centre in the world. The Industrial Revolution in Great Britain would not have developed so quickly without the availability of this capital for investment. Raw materials for the Industrial Revolution. As important as the capital for investment was the access to cheap raw materials that the East India Company facilitated. The EIC was able to establish large-scale cotton production in India to provide raw materials for Britain's rapidly growing textile industry. The funds repatriated from India provided the investment in power looms and other technological advancements, while the cotton crop fed those looms and allowed Britain to dominate world textile markets for many years. An additional feature of the East India Company's control was that it was able to destroy India's own textile manufacturing capabilities. Before the 19th century, India was an exporter of the world's finest textiles, but EIC control ended that. As well as cotton, the EIC facilitated the supply of spices, sugar, tea and other commodities to Britain, feeding the demands of the population and of business. New markets for the Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned in the previous section, the East India Company actively destroyed India's own textile industry in order to support that in Great Britain. Tariffs and trade restrictions made it very expensive to export Indian finished goods across the British Empire. By contrast, British goods could be sold in India without tariffs. India was deindustrialised and impoverished to support the growth of British industries. With its own industry crushed, India became a major importer of British cloth. The East India Company's control over India and dominance over trade in China and other nations provided large export markets for British goods, often supported through force and unfair practices. Global distribution for the Industrial Revolution. The East India Company's control over vast territories provided British industries with captive markets, but the EIC's influence was greater even than that. Over the centuries of its operation, the East India Company had established global trading routes protected by the British Navy or the EIC's own forces. The EIC developed profitable contacts with merchants and traders all over the world. This trading network facilitated the flow of British goods, capital and information. At the same time, the EIC's requirement for a large trading fleet stimulated the British shipbuilding industry and provided technological advances that supported other businesses expanding internationally. The EIC's experiencing of managing a large organisation and vast territories, and its commercial expertise, provided managerial advantages for growing British businesses trading internationally. The East India Company, champion or villain. The Industrial Revolution developed faster and more effectively in Great Britain than in any other nation. Between 1770 and 1870, British industry was the most advanced in the world, and it dominated most markets. After 1870, the technological advantage began to shift to Germany and the United States. The East India Company played a major role in the Industrial Revolution, particularly in its early development. Through the vast wealth it returned to the country, the cheap raw materials it made available, and the vast trading network it provided. Great Britain might not have achieved such dominance without the EIC. But those advantages came at a high price, particularly to the peoples dominated by the East India Company. Those peoples were forcibly impoverished to feed the machine in Britain. The East India Company exploited and oppressed. It used unfair and coercive trading practices and military force to achieve its aims. It destroyed indigenous industries to support the growth of British industries. By any measure, the East India Company cannot be seen as a force for good by the countries it targeted. And yet it was a crucial element in Britain's greatness for well over 100 years. As a British person, I do not know how to react. I feel horror at the practices of the East India Company, but pride at the technological advances made by my country. We cannot have one without the other. It makes me feel very queasy. We are shaped by a history we didn't choose, but we bear responsibility for how we respond to that inheritance. It's a difficult balance. Let me end with a quote from a poem by Maya Angelou called On the Pulse of Morning, and delivered at President Clinton's inauguration in 1993. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.